October 6th, 1941. 17 kilometers southwest of Mtsensk, Russia. Junior Lieutenant Dmitry Lavernenko felt the sweat run down his spine despite the October chill as he scanned the morning fog through his T-34's narrow vision slit. Through the haze, he could see the dark shapes of German tanks advancing along the Orel-Tula highway, their hulking silhouettes barely visible at what he estimated was 1,500 meters. His crew had been told the T-34 was invincible, that German guns couldn't scratch its revolutionary sloped armor. Lavernenko gripped the controls of his 26-ton steel fortress, confident in the mathematics of its protection. The frontal hull was 45 millimeters of hardened steel, angled at 60 degrees from vertical, creating an effective thickness of 90 millimeters. No German tank gun in existence could penetrate it at this range. What Lavernenko didn't know was that among those distant shapes wasn't a tank at all. Positioned on a slight ridge 2,000 meters away sat an 88mm Flak 36 anti-aircraft gun, its long barrel depressed for ground fire, crewed by men from the Luftwaffe's anti-aircraft battalion attached to the 4th Panzer Division. Within the next 10 minutes, Lavernenko's entire understanding of armored warfare would be shattered. The T-34, hailed as the most advanced tank in the world, the machine that had sent German panzer crews into panic just months before, was about to face a weapon that transformed it from predator to prey. The 88mm Flak gun could penetrate 105 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters and 72 millimeters at 2,000 meters, fired armor-piercing shells weighing 9.5 kilograms at 820 meters per second, and delivered death with a precision that Soviet tankers had never imagined possible. This is the story of the brutal awakening on the Eastern Front, of how a weapon designed to shoot down bombers became the most feared tank killer in history, of the moment Soviet tank crews discovered that invincibility was an illusion and that death could reach them from distances they thought were safe. The morning of June 22, 1941, had brought the thunder of Operation Barbarossa crashing across the Soviet frontier. 4 million Axis troops, 3,600 tanks, and over 2,700 aircraft surged into Soviet territory along a 1,800-mile front, launching the largest invasion in human history. Wehrmacht commanders expected to face obsolete Soviet armor, the light T-26 and BT series tanks that their intelligence had cataloged. Their 37mm PaK-36 anti-tank guns, their short-barreled 50mm weapons, their Panzer III and IV tanks, all had been designed to destroy these threats. But on June 23, 1941, the second day of the invasion, German soldiers encountered something their intelligence had failed to predict. Two revolutionary Soviet tank designs that would change the course of armored warfare forever: the T-34 medium tank and the massive KV-1 heavy tank. Lieutenant Erwin Stoip of the 6th Panzer Division's account of his first encounter with a T-34 near the Lithuanian border captured the shock perfectly. His after-action report, filed on June 23rd, detailed hitting the same T-34 5 times with tungsten-cored Panzergranate 40 rounds from his Panzer III's 50mm gun, once at barely 20 meters, 4 more times at 50 meters. The tungsten rounds, Germany's most advanced anti-tank ammunition, bounced off like pebbles thrown against a castle wall. Half a dozen anti-tank guns from his company's anti-tank platoon poured fire into the lone Soviet tank, creating what Stoop described as a sound like a drum roll. But the T-34 drove staunchly through their defensive line like what he called an impregnable prehistoric monster. The T-34's revolutionary design shocked every German tanker and anti-tank gunner who saw it. Designer Mikhail Koshkin had created something unprecedented, a medium tank with heavy tank protection, achieved through brilliance rather than mass. The hull armor was only 45 millimeters thick, but sloped at 60 degrees from vertical. This created an effective thickness of 90 millimeters against direct fire. The turret carried 45 to 56 millimeters of cast armor, also sloped for maximum deflection. The 76.2mm F-34 gun, mounted on the model 1941 variant, could penetrate any German tank at 1,000 meters, while the wide Christie suspension and powerful V2 diesel engine gave it mobility that German tanks simply couldn't match. But the KV-1 heavy tank was even more terrifying. Named for Soviet Defense Commissar Klement Voroshilov, this 48-ton monster carried 75 millimeters of armor on its frontal plate and turret, thick enough to defeat anything the Germans possessed. Armed with the same 76.2 millimeter gun as the T-34, the KV-1 was slower, less agile, but practically invulnerable to standard German anti-tank weapons. The Battle of Raseiniai in Lithuania from June 23rd to 27th, 1941, demonstrated the terrible reality facing German forces. The 6th Panzer Division's Kampfgruppe Raus, commanded by General Erhard Raus, encountered Soviet mechanized forces equipped with both T-34s and KV tanks. German combat reports from those 5 days of fighting described a nightmare scenario. Their 37mm Pak 36 anti-tank guns, nicknamed door knockers by the troops, achieved 23 direct hits on a single T-34, the shells bouncing off uselessly until one finally jammed the turret ring at point-blank range. The 50mm Pak 38 guns, their newest anti-tank weapons, could penetrate a T-34 only at 300 to 400 meters under ideal conditions, requiring hits at precise angles to the sloped armor. Against the KV-1's thicker plates, even the 50mm guns were useless beyond 100 meters. Before I continue with how the Germans discovered their solution, I want to thank you for taking the time to learn about this crucial moment in armored warfare history. Please consider subscribing if you're enjoying this story. On June 24th, 1941, a lone KV-1 tank from the 3rd Company, 1st Battalion, 4th Tank Regiment took up position at a crossroads near the village of Raseiniai. The crew, never definitively identified, but believed to have been commanded by a junior officer whose name was lost to history, positioned their 48-ton fortress across the only road leading from the German-held western bank of the Dubiza River toward Raseiniai itself. What followed became one of the most extraordinary defensive stands in military history. The solitary KV-1 first engaged a German supply column, its 76.2 millimeter gun systematically destroying trucks and lighter vehicles. When 450 millimeter Pak 38 anti-tank guns from the 6th Panzer Division's anti-tank battalion attempted to engage, the KV-1's gunner destroyed all 4 weapons, the heavy armor-piercing shells simply punching through the gun shields and killing the crews. The Germans brought up an 88mm Flak 18 anti-aircraft gun, positioning it 730 meters behind the Soviet tank. But before the crew could acquire their target and fire, the KV-1's turret traversed with terrifying speed. One 76.2mm high-explosive shell struck the 88's position, killing or wounding the entire gun crew. The massive anti-aircraft gun sat silent, knocked out before it could deliver a single shot. Through the night of June 24th, German combat engineers attempted to destroy the KV-1 with satchel charges, crawling through the darkness to plant explosives on the tank's tracks and hull. Machine gun fire from the tank's defensive weapons drove them back, the demolition charges they did manage to plant proving insufficient to penetrate the heavy armor. Early on the morning of June 25th, the Germans finally developed a coordinated assault plan. Light Panzer 35T tanks from the 65th Panzer Battalion were ordered to distract the KV-1 from the front, drawing its attention and fire, while another 88mm flak gun was carefully positioned 700 to 800 meters to the tank's rear. This time, with the Soviet crew focused on the maneuvering panzers to their front, the 88mm crew had time to aim. The first shot missed. The second round struck the turret, but failed to penetrate. The third, fourth, and fifth shots all hit, 2 finally punching through the thick armor and entering the fighting compartment. Even then, the KV-1 didn't immediately fall silent. German pioneers who had been waiting nearby rushed forward as the turret stopped moving, believing the crew dead. But as they approached, the turret suddenly began to traverse again. The crew, merely stunned by the penetrating hits, were attempting to fight on. The pioneers hastily pushed hand grenades through the holes the 88mm shells had torn in the armor, the explosions finally silencing the heroic crew. 6 men were found dead inside when the Germans finally entered the tank. The KV-1 had held a crucial crossroads for over 24 hours against an entire German division, destroyed 4 anti-tank guns, 1 88mm flak gun, multiple supply vehicles, and caused casualties among infantry and engineers, all with a single tank that never received reinforcements or support. The Germans buried the crew with military honors near the battlefield, recognizing the courage of warriors who had fought to the absolute last. In 1965, Soviet authorities exhumed the remains and reburied them with full ceremony at the military cemetery in Raseiniai, honoring men whose names were never recorded, but whose sacrifice had bought precious time for the Red Army. But the Battle of Raseiniai had revealed something crucial to German commanders. Among all their weapons, only the 88mm Flak gun, designed and deployed as an anti-aircraft weapon, could reliably destroy Soviet heavy armor at combat ranges. This lesson would be driven home with terrible force throughout the summer and fall of 1941. The 88mm gun's journey to this moment was itself extraordinary. Developed in secret during the 1920s in Sweden to circumvent the Treaty of Versailles restrictions on German rearmament, Krupp engineers working with the Swedish Bofors Company had created one of the most versatile weapons in military history. Initially designated the Flak 18, the weapon entered German service in 1933, with improved Flak 36 and Flak 37 models following throughout the 1930s. The designation Flak, short for Fliegerabwehrkanone, anti-aircraft gun, revealed its intended purpose to destroy enemy aircraft at altitudes up to 8,000 meters. The 88mm Flak gun fired an 88 by 571mm round from a barrel 4.93 meters long, creating a muzzle velocity of 820 meters per second for armor-piercing projectiles. Three main ammunition types served the weapon: high explosive shells with time fuses for aircraft, high explosive rounds with percussion fuses for ground targets, and armor-piercing shells with ballistic caps for anti-tank work. The armor-piercing round, designated Panzergranate 39, weighed 9.5 kilograms and could penetrate 105 millimeters of armor angled at 30 degrees from vertical at 1,000 meters. At 2,000 meters, penetration decreased to 72 millimeters at the same angle, but this was still more than sufficient to defeat a T-34's 45mm base armor thickness, even accounting for the slope. The gun's carriage, mounted on the Sonderanhänger 201 or 202 trailer, provided 360-degree traverse when deployed on its cruciform platform. A crew of 11 men, commander, 2 gun operators, 2 fuse setter operators, 1 loader, 4 ammunition assistants, and a driver could achieve a sustained rate of fire of 15 to 20 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. Maximum range against ground targets reached 14,860 meters, nearly 9 miles, though effective anti-tank engagements typically occurred at 800 to 2,500 meters. The weapon had proven its versatility during the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, where German Condor Legion forces discovered that the 88 could destroy Republican T-26 and BT tanks with ease when deployed in the direct fire role. During the 1940 campaign in France, 88mm batteries stopped British Matilda II and French Char B-1 bis heavy tanks that were impervious to standard German anti-tank guns. At the Battle of Arras in May 1940, General Erwin Rommel personally directed 88mm guns against British armor, halting a counterattack that threatened to disrupt the German advance. By June 1941, when Operation Barbarossa began, the Wehrmacht deployed 51 mixed anti-aircraft battalions equipped with 88mm guns, most subordinated to the Luftwaffe but attached to Army Corps for ground support. These units would become the Eastern Front's primary defense against Soviet heavy armor. Hauptmann Walter Stoer, commanding an 88mm battery attached to the 11th Panzer Division, recorded one early engagement near Berdyshev in western Ukraine in late June 1941. His battery of 4 guns encountered a Soviet counterattack by approximately a dozen T-34 and KV-1 tanks supported by infantry. Stur's after-action report, preserved in German military archives, detailed the engagement. The Soviet tanks approached in a wedge formation at approximately 1,800 meters range. Our first round struck accurately, penetrating the lead T-34's glacis plate and turret. The tank exploded, likely from ammunition detonation. The remaining tanks attempted to close range, but we maintained steady fire. In 12 minutes of engagement, we destroyed 9 Soviet tanks for the expenditure of 87 rounds. 3 enemy tanks withdrew, trailing smoke. Our positions received heavy machine gun and cannon fire from the surviving tanks, but our earth and sandbag emplacements protected the crews. No casualties sustained. This engagement demonstrated both the 88's effectiveness and its vulnerability. The high profile of the weapon, nearly 4 meters tall when deployed, made concealment difficult. The lack of armor protection for the gun crew meant that machine gun fire, artillery fragments, or return fire from tank cannon could inflict casualties. Crews learned to dig pits for the guns, create earth and sandbag berms, and position the weapons on reverse slopes or in tree lines where possible. But the gun's greatest advantage was range. Soviet tankers, accustomed to engaging German panzers at 500 to 800 meters, where the T-34's armor and gun gave them superiority, suddenly discovered they were being destroyed at distances where they couldn't effectively fight back. The 88's flat trajectory out to 1,000 meters made range estimation easier for German gunners, while Soviet T-34 crews struggled with crude optical sights that made precision fire difficult beyond 600 meters. The shock of long-range penetrations created what Soviet tankers began calling 88 fever, a psychological terror induced by the knowledge that death could arrive from an unseen gun position far beyond effective return fire range. October 1941 brought this terror to its peak during the German drive on Moscow. Colonel Mikhail Katakov's 4th Tank Brigade, equipped with 22 T-34 tanks, 7 KV-1 heavy tanks, and 32 lighter BT-7 tanks, deployed near Mtsensk to delay General Heinz Guderian's Panzer Group II. Katakov, one of the Red Army's most skilled armor commanders, had trained his men at the Stalingrad tractor plant, where they had actually participated in assembling T-34s, learning every detail of the tank's construction and capabilities. This intimate knowledge of their machine's strengths and weaknesses made Katakov's brigade one of the most effective Soviet armored units of 1941. On the morning of October 6th, Katakov positioned his tanks in carefully prepared ambush positions near the village of Voin, south of Mtsensk. The 4th Panzer Division's lead battle group, Kampfgruppe Eberbach, commanded by Colonel Heinrich Eberbach, advanced along the Orel-Tula highway expecting minimal resistance. They had captured the city of Orel just days before and believed the road to Moscow lay open. Junior Lieutenant Dmitry Lavernenko, commanding one of Katakov's T-34s, had hidden his tank in a depression facing the highway. Around him, 20 other T-34s and KV-1s waited in concealed positions. Infantry support deployed in the woods behind them. The morning fog that had covered their deployment was beginning to lift. At approximately 8:30 hours, the lead elements of Kampfgruppe Eberbach came into view. Panzer IIIs and IVs advanced in column along the highway, confident in their momentum. Behind them came trucks carrying infantry, supply vehicles, and positioned on low ridges flanking the road, the 88mm Flak guns that had become essential to every German combined arms formation. Katakov gave the order to fire. 22 T-34s and 7 KV-1s burst from concealment, charging across the open ground toward the German column's flank. The surprise was complete. At ranges of 400 to 600 meters, the Soviet 76.2mm guns tore into the lighter German tanks. Panzer IIIs with their 50mm armor stood no chance. Panzer IVs with their short-barreled 75mm guns, designed for infantry support rather than anti-tank work, found themselves outgunned and out-armored. German Colonel Erich Schneider, the 4th Panzer Division's artillery commander, later wrote in his post-action report for U.S. Army historical researchers, "The Soviet heavy tanks blasted our Panzer Kampfgruppe immediately after we crossed the Lisiza River Bridge. Our tanks had no answer to these machines at that range. We withdrew to defensive positions south of the engagement area, while our artillery, including the 88mm guns positioned on the overlooking ridges, engaged the Soviet armor." This is where the battle transformed from a Soviet triumph into a revelation of the 88's terrible power. The flak gun crews, positioned on ridges 1,500 to 2,000 meters from the Soviet attack, had clear fields of fire across the open ground. As Katakov's T-34s pursued the withdrawing panzers, they exposed themselves to these distant gun positions. The 88mm gunners had trained for years engaging fast-moving aircraft, tracking and leading targets, traveling at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Tanks moving at 40 to 50 kilometers per hour across open ground were, by comparison, nearly stationary targets. Lavrenenko's T-34 was advancing at maximum speed, his driver navigating across the rough ground when something massive struck the tank's right side with a sound like a giant hammer on an anvil. The entire 26-ton vehicle shuddered, slewing sideways from the impact's force. Lavrenenko's first thought was that they'd been hit by a Panzer IV's 75mm gun, but the range was all wrong. Those tanks were 600 meters ahead. Then another hit, this time striking the glacis plate, the shell penetrating the sloped armor and deflecting upward through the driver's compartment. The driver screamed as fragments and spalling tore through the confined space. Through the smoke and confusion, Lavrenenko realized they were under fire from positions far beyond where any German tank could effectively engage them. The 88mm guns, nearly invisible at 800 to 2,000 meters, were systematically destroying Katakov's tanks from ranges the Soviets had believed were safe. Another T-34 exploded in a massive fireball 200 meters to Lavrenenko's left, its ammunition detonating from a penetrating hit. A KV-1, the supposedly invulnerable heavy tank, ground to a halt with smoke pouring from its engine deck, an 88mm armor-piercing shell having punched completely through its 75mm turret armor and into the engine compartment. Katakov, recognizing the deadly effectiveness of the distant guns, ordered his brigade to withdraw to prepared defensive positions in the tree line where the 88's direct line of sight was blocked. The attack had destroyed or damaged approximately a dozen German tanks, but Soviet losses were mounting rapidly. Katakov's brigade had begun the engagement with 61 tanks. By the end of the day's fighting, 28 tanks had been destroyed or damaged, and 555 men were killed, wounded, or missing. The 88mm guns accounted for the majority of tank losses. German records showed different numbers, as was typical. Both sides tended to overestimate enemy casualties and underestimate their own, but both agreed on the engagement's significance. The 4th Panzer Division's advance, which had covered hundreds of kilometers in just days, ground to a halt for an entire week. The 60 kilometers from Orel to Mtsensk took 9 days to traverse, and Guderian's schedule for reaching Moscow was fatally disrupted. More importantly, Guderian was so shaken by the performance of Soviet T-34 and KV tanks that, on October 20th, 1941, he demanded that a special Panzer Commission be sent to the Eastern Front to examine the captured Soviet tanks and reassess German tank development. The commission, including automotive engineer Ferdinand Porsche and tank designer Erwin Adders, arrived in November 1941. They studied destroyed and captured T-34s between Orel and Mtsensk, examining the armor that German tank guns couldn't penetrate and the sloped design that provided such effective protection. This commission's recommendations would eventually lead to the development of the Panther tank, which borrowed the T-34's concepts of sloped armor, wide tracks for mobility, and a powerful, long-barreled gun. German tank design would never be the same, but the immediate lesson from Mtsensk was tactical, not technological. The 88mm gun was no longer just an anti-aircraft weapon that could be used in emergencies against tanks. It became a primary anti-tank weapon, deployed in integrated combined arms formations specifically to counter Soviet armor. Every German panzer division, every motorized division, every defensive position of significance began organizing around the 88mm guns that could keep Soviet tanks at bay. The transformation of Soviet tank tactics was equally profound. Before encounters with the 88, T-34 crews had been trained to close rapidly with German forces, using their superior armor protection to get into range where their 76.2mm guns could be most effective. The first months of Barbarossa had seen T-34s and KV-1s charging German positions, confident that the enemy's weapons couldn't hurt them at medium ranges. The 88mm destroyed that confidence utterly. Tank commanders like Dmitry Lavrenenko, who survived the Mtsensk engagement to become one of the Soviet Union's top tank aces with 52 confirmed kills before his death in December 1941, learned to use terrain obsessively. Ridge lines that blocked long-range observation, forests that prevented direct fire, ravines and gullies that allowed approach without exposure, these became the T-34's lifeline. Soviet doctrine evolved to emphasize concealed approach, use of terrain masking, and rapid assault from unexpected directions rather than the grinding frontal attacks that exposed tanks to the 88's devastating long-range fire. Guards Lieutenant Ivan Lavrinenko, Dmitri's brother and also a tank commander in Katakov's brigade, later recounted in his memoirs, "After Mtsensk, we understood that the Germans had found our weakness. The 88mm gun could kill us at ranges where we couldn't accurately return fire. Our optical sights were crude, our gunners undertrained for long-range precision work. The Germans, with their excellent optics and well-trained crews, could strike us from positions we couldn't even see clearly. We learned to advance using every depression in the ground, every stand of trees, anything that broke the Germans' line of sight. When we had to cross open ground, we did it at maximum speed, zigzagging, presenting as difficult a target as possible, and we learned to call for artillery support against any suspected 88 position before committing our tanks." The psychological impact on Soviet tank crews was profound. Interviews with survivors conducted by Soviet military historians after the war revealed a consistent pattern of what one researcher called 88 anxiety. Tankers described the terrible uncertainty of knowing that an unseen gun position might be tracking their tank from 2,000 meters away, that death could arrive with no warning except the sudden massive impact of a 9.5 kilogram armor-piercing shell traveling at 820 meters per second. This was fundamentally different from tank versus tank combat, where both sides could see each other, where skill and tactics and a degree of luck determine the outcome. Against the 88, Soviet tankers felt helpless. The gun's high profile meant it was difficult to hide, but at 1,500 to 2,000 meters, even a partially concealed 88 was nearly impossible for Soviet tank crews to spot with their limited optical equipment. By the time they saw the muzzle flash, the shell was already in flight. Senior Sergeant Nikolai Malafeev, a T-34 driver who fought from Kursk to Berlin, described the sound of an 88mm hit in an interview recorded in 1965. "It wasn't like being hit by a tank gun. Tank shells made a sharp crack when they hit armor. The 88 made a sound like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil, but amplified 1,000 times. The entire tank rang like a bell. If the shell penetrated, you heard a second sound, a metallic screaming as the penetrator tore through the armor plating. Then came the fragments, hot metal spraying through the fighting compartment, the smell of burned steel and explosive, the smoke. If you were lucky, the shell passed through without hitting anything vital, without detonating ammunition or fuel. But even a non-penetrating hit from an 88 would often crack welds, jam turret traverse, or knock out systems. We learned to fear that sound above all others." The mathematics of penetration explained the terror. The T-34's glacis plate was 45 millimeters thick, but angled at 60 degrees from vertical. This increased the effective thickness against a direct hit to approximately 90 millimeters. At 1,000 meters, the 88mm Panzergranate 39 could penetrate 105 millimeters of armor at 30 degrees from vertical, more than sufficient to defeat the T-34's protection. Even at 2,000 meters, the 88 could still penetrate 72 millimeters at 30 degrees, and while this was less than the T-34's effective armor thickness at optimal angles, real combat conditions rarely involved perfect angles. A T-34 turning, presenting its side, or positioned on uneven ground that changed its aspect, could be vulnerable even at extreme range. The turret armor, 45 to 56 millimeters depending on variant, offered even less protection. Many T-34s were destroyed by 88mm hits to the turret that punched through the armor, killed the commander and gunner, and often detonated ammunition stored in the turret bustle. The KV-1, with its 75mm frontal armor, was more resistant but still vulnerable to the 88 at ranges under 1,500 meters when hit at favorable angles. Soviet Weapons Research Institution NII-48, conducting post-battle analysis in 1942, determined that 88mm guns account for 51.6% of what they categorized as dangerous hits, penetrations that either destroyed the tank outright or caused casualties and damage requiring major repair. This was an extraordinary figure considering that 88mm guns represented a small fraction of all German anti-tank weapons deployed on the Eastern Front. The number meant that when a T-34 was destroyed or seriously damaged by German fire, there was better than a 50% chance that an 88mm gun had been responsible. Other weapons, the 50mm Pak-38, the short 75mm guns on Panzer IVs, the growing numbers of long-barreled 75mm Pak-40 guns introduced in 1942 all contributed to Soviet tank losses. But the 88mm remained the most reliable, the most feared, the weapon that could reach out across the Eastern Front's vast distances and kill Soviet armor at ranges that should have been safe. German production of 88mm ammunition was staggering. By mid-1942, German factories were producing millions of rounds monthly, with significant percentages designated for ground combat rather than anti-aircraft work. The standard combat load for an 88mm flak battery operating in the anti-tank role included 300 to 400 rounds of Panzergranate 39 armor-piercing ammunition per gun, supplemented by high-explosive rounds for engaging soft targets and dug-in infantry positions. The evolution of 88mm weapons technology continued throughout the war. The original Flak 18, 36, and 37 models were supplemented by the improved Flak 41, which had an even higher muzzle velocity and could penetrate thicker armor at longer ranges. More significantly, the 88mm gun was adapted for mounting in armored fighting vehicles. The 88mm KWK-36, a modified version of the Flak 36, became the main armament of the Tiger I heavy tank in 1942. This weapon used the same ammunition as the towed flak guns and could penetrate 120 millimeters of armor at 500 meters with standard ammunition. When T-34 crews encountered Tiger, Briz is equipped with the 88mm KWK-36 for the first time near Leningrad in late 1942 and early 1943. The terror of facing 88mm guns merged with the nightmare of facing them from an almost invulnerable platform. The Tiger Eye's frontal armor, 100 millimeters thick and vertical, could not be penetrated by the T-34's 76.2 millimeter gun, except at very close range and with perfect shot placement. Meanwhile, the Tiger's 88 millimeter gun could destroy T-34s at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Soviet Senior Sergeant Alexander Markov, a T-34 platoon commander, survived an encounter with the Tiger I's near Mega in January 1943. His report to his battalion commander detailed the engagement. We spotted the German heavy tank at approximately 1,400 meters, positioned hull down behind a snow embankment. Our platoon, 3 T-34s, attempted to maneuver for a flank shot, but the snow was deep and movement was slow. The Tiger engaged us while we were still maneuvering. The first shot destroyed Lieutenant Bershov's tank, penetrating the glacis plate and detonating ammunition. The tank crew perished instantly. The second shot struck my own tank's turret, but somehow failed to penetrate, though it jammed the turret traverse and knocked out our main gun. We abandoned the tank and withdrew on foot. The third tank of our platoon attempted to close range, advancing through a ravine to within 600 meters before achieving a firing position. 3 shots from the T-34's gun struck the Tiger's frontal armor. All bounced off, without effect. The Tiger's return fire penetrated the T-34's glacis plate, killing the driver and bow gunner. The rest of the crew escaped. 1 Tiger tank destroyed 2 T-34s and damaged a third in less than 5 minutes of engagement. We could not harm it, but it could destroy us at will. This asymmetry, this terrible imbalance, defined much of the tank warfare on the Eastern Front from late 1941 through 1943. Soviet numerical superiority, the production of thousands of T-34s monthly from factories in the Urals and Siberia, was necessary, not because individual T-34s were inferior tanks. In fact, they remained superior to most German panzers in armor protection and armament. But because the presence of 88mm guns in towed and self-propelled form meant that Soviet armor constantly faced weapons that could kill them at ranges where they struggled to fight back effectively. The introduction of the T-34-85 in early 1944, armed with an 85mm gun in an enlarged three-man turret, finally gave Soviet medium tanks a weapon that could penetrate Tiger I frontal armor at reasonable combat ranges. But even this improved T-34 variant faced challenges against the new Tiger II, armed with the longer 88mm KWK-43L71 gun that could penetrate even heavier armor at even greater ranges. Throughout the war's final years, as the Red Army drove the Wehrmacht back toward Berlin, the 88mm gun remained a constant threat. Defensive positions at river crossings in fortified towns around vital road junctions, all organized around dug-in 88mm guns that could dominate the approaches and exact a terrible toll on attacking Soviet armor. Guards Captain Viktor Bryukov, commanding a T-34-85 company during the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945, encountered one such position near Radom, Poland. His after-action report, filed on January 18, 1945, described the engagement. German forces had established a defense in depth along the approach to the Radom railway junction. Intelligence reported at least 6 88mm guns positioned in carefully prepared emplacements with interlocking fields of fire covering the open ground we needed to cross. Our artillery fired a 30-minute preparation, but the German guns were well protected in reinforced positions and most survived. When our company advanced, 3 tanks in the lead platoon were destroyed in the first minute of the engagement, all struck at ranges exceeding 1,600 meters. We called for smoke artillery to obscure the German observation, and under this cover we were able to advance using a ravine that provided defilade from the 88 positions. Eventually, we flanked 2 of the gun positions and destroyed them with close-range fire and infantry assault. But the cost was 7 T-34-85s destroyed and 3 more damaged for the elimination of 2 88mm gun positions. The Germans withdrew the remaining guns during the night. This pattern, high Soviet losses to eliminate 88mm positions, repeated across thousands of engagements throughout the war's final year. Even as the Wehrmacht contracted, even as fuel and ammunition shortages limited German mobility and sustainability, the 88mm gun remained devastatingly effective in the hands of well-trained crews with good fields of fire. By the war's end in May 1945, Germany had produced approximately 21,000 88mm flak guns of all variants. Thousands more 88mm tank guns equipped Tigers and other armored fighting vehicles. These weapons accounted for an estimated 30 to 40% of all Soviet tank losses on the Eastern Front from 1941 to 1945, an extraordinary percentage, considering that 88mm guns represented perhaps 5 to 10% of German anti-tank weaponry by number. The psychological legacy outlasted the war. Interviews with Soviet veterans conducted in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s consistently revealed that the 88mm gun remained the weapon they feared most, more than Tiger tanks. They were just platforms for the 88, more than German panzers, which could be fought on relatively equal terms, more than aircraft or artillery. The 88 represented something unique, a weapon that could reach out across vast distances and destroy you before you even knew it was there. Dmitry Lavrenenko, who had survived the baptism of fire at Mtsensk in October 1941, continued fighting through November and December, perfecting the tactics that allowed T-34s to survive and thrive against German combined arms forces that included 88mm guns. His score of confirmed kills reached 52 German tanks and assault guns, making him one of the Soviet Union's most successful tank aces. But on December 17, 1941, near the village of Goritsi during the Soviet counteroffensive at Moscow, Lavrenenko was killed not by an 88, but by a mortar fragment while observing enemy positions from outside his tank. He was 27 years old. He had survived 2.5 months of the most intense armored combat in history, had learned to fear and respect the 88mm gun, had developed tactics to minimize its threat, and had proven that skilled Soviet tankers and T-34s could prevail despite facing the weapon that had initially seemed invincible. But the brutal arithmetic of warfare caught him anyway. The lesson of the 88mm gun's effectiveness against T-34s at 2,000 meters rippled through Soviet military thought for decades. Post-war tank development emphasized not just armor protection and firepower, but also optical systems, fire control equipment, and crew training that would allow Soviet tanks to engage effectively at the long ranges where the 88 had dominated. The T-54, T-62, and T-72 tanks that formed the backbone of Soviet armored forces through the Cold War all reflected lessons learned in the terrible encounters with 88mm guns across the Eastern Front's vast killing fields. At the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow, a perfectly restored T-34 model 1941 sits in a place of honor, its 45mm sloped glacis armor bearing a plaque that explains the tank's revolutionary design. Nearby, in the German armament section, stands an 88mm Flak 36, its long barrel angled downward as if still hunting for targets across the steppes. The two weapons, Predator and Prey, symbol of Soviet innovation and German tactical adaptation, face each other across the museum floor, just as they faced each other across thousands of battlefields from 1941 to 1945. There is no glory in the story of the 88mm gun versus the T-34. Only mathematics, brutal and unforgiving. 45 millimeters of sloped armor, providing protection equivalent to 90 millimeters against direct hits. 88 millimeters of German steel propelling a 9.5 kilogram projectile at 820 meters per second, capable of penetrating 105 millimeters at 1,000 meters and 72 millimeters at 2,000 meters. The numbers told the story. The equations predicted the outcome. And tens of thousands of Soviet tankers died learning what those numbers meant in reality. Junior Lieutenant Dmitry Lavrenenko, looking through his T-34's vision slit on that October morning in 1941, had believed his tank was invincible. Within minutes, he discovered that invincibility was a myth, that German ingenuity and industrial capability had created a weapon that transformed the most advanced tank in the world into a vulnerable target at ranges that should have been safe. The thunder of the 88mm echoed across the Eastern Front for 4 years. The sound of that gun, the hammer-on-anvil impact, the screaming of penetrating steel haunted Soviet tankers for the rest of their lives. Even in victory, even driving into Berlin in April 1945, the veterans who had survived from 1941 remembered. They remembered Mtsensk. They remembered Kursk. They remembered 1,000 battlefields where comrades had died to 88mm fire that reached them from distances they couldn't match. The transformation from confidence to terror had taken just minutes. The lessons learned had taken years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. That was the brutal awakening of Soviet tank crews on the Eastern Front. The day they discovered the 88mm gun could kill them at 2,000 meters. The day invincibility died. If you found this story valuable, please consider subscribing to support more historical content like this. Thank you for watching.